July 27, 1943. Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city, is about to experience something unprecedented in human history. As 739 Allied aircraft unleash their deadly cargo from above, temperatures on the ground reach 1,000 degrees Celsius. The very air catches fire. Streets become rivers of molten asphalt. People seeking shelter in basements suffocate not from smoke, but because the firestorm literally sucks the oxygen from their lungs. What happened next would be repeated across dozens of German cities over the following 2 years. Dresden, Berlin, Nuremberg, Munich. Each name represents not just a military target, but a human catastrophe of staggering proportions. By war's end, over 600,000 German civilians would perish under Allied bombs, and millions more would face a brutal reality that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. Today, we examine one of World War II's most controversial chapters, the systematic bombing of German cities and the devastating aftermath that forever changed the lives of ordinary Germans. This isn't just about military strategy or wartime necessity. This is about human suffering on an industrial scale and the brutal fate that awaited survivors in a world turned to ash. The campaign begins. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany didn't begin with the massive 1,000-bomber raids that would later devastate entire cities. It started gradually, almost experimentally, as British and American commanders grappled with how to strike at the heart of Nazi Germany. By 1943, the campaign had evolved into something far more systematic and deadly. The point-blank directive, issued in June 1943, specifically targeted German fighter production facilities. But it was Operation Gomorrah, the assault on Hamburg, that would demonstrate the true destructive potential of strategic bombing. Arthur Harris, the commander of RAF Bomber Command, had earned the nickname Bomber Harris for his unwavering belief in the power of aerial bombardment. To Harris, the bombing of German cities wasn't just about destroying military targets, it was about breaking the will of the German people themselves. The technology of destruction had advanced rapidly. The Avro Lancaster, Britain's primary heavy bomber, could carry 6,350 kilograms of bombs deep into German territory. The B-17 Flying Fortress, though carrying a smaller payload of 2,722 kilograms, could operate in daylight with fighter escort. Together, these aircraft would deliver death on a scale previously unimaginable, but it was the tactics that made the difference. Pathfinder aircraft would mark targets with magnesium flares, nicknamed Christmas trees by the crews, creating brilliant illumination that turned night into day. Behind them came waves of bombers carrying a deadly mixture of high explosive and incendiary devices, designed not just to destroy buildings, but to create unstoppable firestorms. The stage was set for one of the most devastating campaigns in military history. German cities, packed with civilians, refugees, and the infrastructure of daily life, were about to become battlefields in a war that would spare no one. Operation Gomorrah, the Hamburg Firestorm, July 24, 1943, marked the beginning of Operation Gomorrah, an 8-day campaign that would forever change how the world understood the destructive power of strategic bombing. Hamburg, with its vital port facilities and industrial capacity, had been selected for what the RAF termed maximum effort. The first night brought 791 British aircraft over the city, but this was just the beginning. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction that would unfold over 8 nightmarish days and nights. July 25th saw 40 American bombers strike the port facilities in daylight. The next day, 71 USAF aircraft targeted the port and Neuhof power plant. Each attack built upon the previous one, systematically destroying Hamburg's ability to function as a city. But it was the night of July 27th to 28th that created hell on earth. 739 aircraft unleashed their cargo over Hamburg, and something unprecedented occurred. The combination of high explosives and incendiary devices created what meteorologists now call a firestorm, a weather phenomenon where fires become so intense they create their own wind systems. The physics of what happened in Hamburg that night defies imagination. Temperatures reached 1,000 degrees Celsius. The superheated air created winds of hurricane force, with gusts reaching 240 kilometers per hour. The fire didn't just burn, it consumed everything in its path, including the oxygen needed for human survival. In the basement shelters where families huddled together, death came not from fire or falling debris, but from asphyxiation. The firestorm literally sucked the air from underground spaces, leaving behind scenes that would haunt rescue workers for decades. The streets themselves became death traps. Asphalt melted and flowed like lava. People who ventured outside found their shoes sticking to the molten pavement. Some were trapped and died where they stood. Others were pulled into the inferno by the hurricane-force winds created by the fire itself. Entire districts of Hamburg simply vanished. Hammerbrook, Rothenburg, Borgfeld, Eilbeck, Wandsbek, Barmbek, Uhlenhorst, Winterhude. Neighborhoods that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and rubble in a single night. The bombing continued for 3 more days. July 29th to 30th brought 726 British bombers. The final assault on August 2nd to 3rd involved 740 aircraft. By November 30th, 1943, recovery teams had retrieved 31,647 bodies from the ruins of Hamburg, of which only 15,802 could be identified. The authorities responsible for air raid defense estimated the total death toll at 35,000, though more recent historical research suggests a figure closer to 34,000 dead and 150,000 injured. The inadequacy of the shelter system prompted a massive evacuation of the city's population. Residents not directly involved in war production were forced to leave Hamburg, with most children relocated to rural areas under the Kinderlandverschickung program. Approximately 900,000 residents fled the city, seeking refuge in Bavaria, occupied Poland, and the eastern territories of Germany. But the numbers, devastating as they are, cannot capture the human reality of what occurred. Families were separated forever. Children wandered the rubble-strewn streets looking for parents who would never return. The wounded filled hospitals that had themselves been bombed. The survivors faced a reality that would define the rest of their lives. Their city, their world, had been erased. The Battle of Berlin. If Hamburg demonstrated the destructive potential of strategic bombing, the Battle of Berlin would prove that even the heart of Nazi Germany was not beyond Allied reach. From November 1943 to March 1944, Arthur Harris directed a sustained campaign against the German capital that would test both the limits of bomber command and the endurance of Berlin's civilian population. The campaign against Berlin was different from Hamburg in scope and duration. This wasn't a concentrated assault over days, but a grinding months-long siege from the air. 16 major raids struck the city, each one bringing hundreds of aircraft and tons of explosive death. The psychological impact on Berlin's residents was profound. Unlike Hamburg, where the horror was concentrated into a brief, intense period, Berliners lived under the constant threat of death from above. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life. Families spent countless nights in basement shelters, emerging to find their neighborhoods transformed into moonscapes of rubble and despair. The RAF paid a heavy price for their assault on the Nazi capital. 492 aircraft were lost in the major raids alone, each one representing the death of an entire crew. The German defenders, equipped with advanced FUMG-65 Würzburg radars and experienced fighter pilots, extracted a brutal toll from the attacking forces, but the cost to Berlin's civilian population was far greater. At least 400,000 inhabitants lost their homes during the campaign. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. The city's infrastructure, water, electricity, transportation, was systematically destroyed. The human stories from Berlin's ordeal reveal the true cost of strategic bombing. Families huddled in subway tunnels during raids, only to emerge and find their homes destroyed. Children grew up knowing only the reality of war, their education interrupted by the constant threat of death from above. The Battle of Berlin failed to achieve Harris's stated goal of ending the war through bombing alone, but it succeeded in something else. It demonstrated that no German city, no matter how well defended, was safe from Allied attack. The psychological impact of this realization would ripple through German society for the remainder of the war. Black Friday, the Nuremberg disaster. The night of March 30th to 31st, 1944, would become known as Black Friday in RAF history, but for the residents of Nuremberg, it represented something far more personal and devastating. The raid on this historic Bavarian city would demonstrate both the continued determination of Allied Bomber Command and the horrific cost of their campaign for German civilians. 795 aircraft, 572 Lancasters and 214 Halifaxes set course for Nuremberg that night. The target was not just the city's industrial capacity, but its symbolic significance as the site of Nazi party rallies. What followed would be a disaster for both attackers and defenders. The German night fighter force, led by experienced pilots like Martin Becker, who would shoot down 6 aircraft in just 30 minutes over the Ruhr, was ready. Using the innovative Schräge Musik cannon system, upward-firing guns mounted at 80-degree angles, German fighters devastated the bomber stream. The RAF lost 109 aircraft that night, with 545 crew members killed and 160 taken prisoner. It was one of the highest single-night losses in the history of Bomber Command. The German defenders lost just 10 aircraft and 11 pilots, a stark demonstration of how costly the bombing campaign had become. But while military historians focus on the tactical details of the raid, the human cost in Nuremberg itself tells a different story. 133 people died in the city that night, with 72 of those deaths occurring within the city limits. These weren't soldiers or military personnel, they were shopkeepers, factory workers, mothers, children, and elderly residents whose only crime was living in a city that had been selected for destruction. The Nuremberg raid highlighted a brutal reality of the bombing campaign. Civilian casualties were not an unfortunate side effect of military operations, but an inevitable consequence of a strategy that targeted entire cities. The distinction between military and civilian targets had become meaningless in the face of area bombing tactics. Dresden, the apocalypse. If any single event encapsulates the horror of the Allied bombing campaign against German cities, it is the destruction of Dresden on February 13th to 15th, 1945. What happened in this Baroque jewel of Central Europe during those 3 days in February has become synonymous with the moral complexity of strategic bombing. Dresden, in February 1945, was a city transformed by war. Its normal population of 642,000 had been swelled by an estimated 200,000 refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. These were mostly women, children, and elderly people, the human flotsam of a collapsing Reich, seeking safety in a city that had been largely spared by the war. The timing of the attack was particularly cruel. February 13th was the Tuesday of Carnival, a traditional celebration when families gathered despite the hardships of wartime. Children were attending parties, families were reunited, and for a brief moment, the normal rhythms of life had resumed in Dresden. The attack began at 10:15 p.m. with 254 Lancasters of the first wave. The Pathfinders marked their targets with the now familiar Christmas trees, magnesium flares that turned night into day. What followed was a textbook demonstration of area bombing designed to create maximum destruction. The first wave targeted the city center, dropping high explosives to blow out windows and remove roofs, creating perfect conditions for the incendiary devices that would follow. 3 hours later, 529 British bombers arrived for the second wave, finding a city already in flames. The strategy was deliberately designed to maximize civilian casualties. The 3-hour gap between waves was calculated to allow rescue workers and firefighters to respond to the first attack, only to be caught in the open when the second wave arrived. It was a tactic that turned courage into a death sentence. The next day brought 316 B-17 flying fortresses in a daylight attack, bombing through the smoke and flames that still consumed the city. The destruction was so complete that American bomber crews reported being able to see the fires from 500 miles away. But it was the human cost that made Dresden a byword for the horrors of strategic bombing. Exact casualty figures remain disputed, but between 60,000 and 75,000 homes were completely destroyed. 800 buildings were reduced to rubble. The human toll included thousands of refugees who had come to Dresden seeking safety, only to find death. The survivors faced a hellscape that defied description. Entire districts had been reduced to ash. The famous Baroque architecture that had made Dresden the Florence of the North was gone, replaced by a wasteland of rubble and twisted metal. Families were separated forever. Children wandered the ruins looking for parents who would never return. The destruction continued even after the main attacks. Follow-up raids on March 2nd and April 17, 1945, targeted the ruins, ensuring that any recovery efforts would be impossible. Dresden had been selected not just for destruction, but for obliteration. The human cost. Life in the ruins. The statistics of the bombing campaign. The tonnage of bombs dropped, the number of aircraft lost, the industrial capacity destroyed, tell only part of the story. The true measure of the Allied bombing campaign lies in the human cost, the millions of German civilians who survived the attacks only to face a brutal struggle for survival in the ruins of their cities. In Hamburg, 900,000 people were evacuated after Operation Gomorrah. These weren't soldiers returning from the front, but ordinary families, mothers with children, elderly people, the wounded, thrust into a refugee crisis of unprecedented scale. They had lost not just their homes, but their entire world. The immediate aftermath of the bombing raids revealed scenes of almost unimaginable horror. Survivors emerged from basement shelters to find their neighborhoods simply gone. Streets they had walked every day for decades were now unrecognizable landscapes of rubble and twisted metal. The familiar landmarks of their lives, churches, schools, shops, had been erased. The search for the missing became a grim ritual repeated in every bombed city. Families would spend weeks digging through rubble, hoping to find survivors but more often discovering bodies. The identification of victims was often impossible. The firestorms had burned so intensely that human remains were reduced to ash. Children bore a particularly heavy burden. An entire generation grew up knowing only the reality of bombing, evacuation and loss. The Kinderlandverschickung program, which relocated children from Hamburg and other targeted cities, separated families that would never be reunited. These children would carry the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. The physical destruction was matched by social collapse. Cities that had functioned for centuries were reduced to pre-industrial conditions overnight. In Dresden, 30% of commercial establishments were out of operation after the bombing. Basic services, water, electricity, transportation were destroyed. Food distribution systems collapsed. Medical care became a nightmare. Hospitals were primary targets in many raids, following the logic that destroying medical facilities would prevent the treatment of both military and civilian casualties. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from lack of medical attention. The psychological impact on survivors was profound and lasting. Modern researchers studying post-traumatic stress disorder have found that bombing survivors exhibited symptoms that persisted for decades. The constant threat of death from above created a generation of Germans who would never fully recover from their wartime experiences. Housing became a critical issue. With millions of homes destroyed, families were forced to live in the ruins of their former lives. Basement shelters became permanent homes. Families crowded into damaged buildings, often sharing single rooms with multiple families. The normal rhythms of private life became impossible. The breakdown of social order was perhaps most evident in the treatment of refugees. As the war progressed and more cities were bombed, the movement of displaced persons became constant. Local communities, already struggling with their own destruction, were forced to absorb waves of refugees who had lost everything. Women faced particular challenges. With their husbands and sons at war, women became responsible for family survival in impossible circumstances. They had to find food, shelter, and safety for their children while navigating the chaos of a collapsing society. Many were forced to make desperate choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The bombing had created a humanitarian crisis that would persist long after the war ended. Millions of Germans would spend the immediate post-war years not in defeated cities, but in refugee camps, temporary shelters, and the ruins of their former homes. The Allied bombing campaign against German cities during World War II represents one of the most controversial chapters in the history of warfare. Between 1940 and 1945, over 600,000 German civilians died under Allied bombs, millions more were wounded or displaced, and entire cities were reduced to rubble. The human cost of this campaign extends far beyond the statistics. It encompasses the individual stories of families destroyed, children orphaned, communities erased, and survivors forced to rebuild their lives from nothing. The psychological trauma inflicted on an entire generation of Germans would persist for decades. The bombing campaign achieved its tactical objectives. German industrial capacity was destroyed, transportation systems were crippled, and civilian morale was broken. But it also raised profound moral questions about the nature of warfare and the treatment of civilian populations that remain relevant today. The survivors of the bombing campaign faced a brutal reality that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. Their stories remind us that behind every military statistic lies human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. The bombing of German cities was not just a military operation, it was a human catastrophe that forever changed the lives of millions of ordinary people whose only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their fate serves as a stark reminder of war's true cost, not just in military casualties or strategic objectives achieved, but in the human lives forever altered by the machinery of destruction. The brutal fate of German bombing survivors stands as testament to the enduring truth that in war, it is always the innocent who pay the highest price.